A ruthless biker snatched a little girl's teddy bear, until a millionaire CEO stepped in, and the truth shocked everyone. Michael Reeves left his glass tower office just as the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in a bruised palette of purples and grays. He had spent the entire day negotiating contracts worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, yet the moment his polished shoes touched the pavement, he felt the weariness in his shoulders pressing down harder than any deal ever had. Adjusting the cuffs of his light blue suit, he was already rehearsing tomorrow's meetings in his head when the sound of raised voices reached him. He slowed, frowning, and turned toward the noise coming from across the street near a crowded cafe. A group of onlookers had gathered in a loose circle, their faces a mixture of discomfort and fascination, and in the center of it all was a scene that made Michael's stomach tighten. A burly biker, bald and heavy-set, stood in his black leather jacket with a cruel smirk twisting his mouth, dangling a small teddy bear just out of reach of a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6, her curly blonde hair falling around her tear-streaked face, her red dress dirted at the hem from kneeling on the ground as she jumped and reached desperately for the toy. Her blue eyes shone with a mixture of fear and heartbreak, and each time she pleaded, "Please give him back," the biker only laughed louder, pulling the bear higher as if it were some sick game meant to entertain the crowd. Michael froze for a moment, his instincts battling with the image he projected to the world. He was a CEO, not a man who involved himself in street altercations. But something about the sight pierced straight through his carefully built armor. The girl's trembling hands, the way she clutched at the air for the bear as though her very life depended on it, awoke something in him that had been buried under years of ambition and detachment. He could hear people whispering, some even chuckling nervously, but no one stepped forward. They all preferred to watch, to film with their phones, to let the cruelty play out as long as it didn't touch them. Michael's jaw tightened. He had built his empire on recognizing when no one else would act, and though this battlefield was not made of contracts and negotiations, it demanded the same courage. He stepped off the curb and walked toward the scene, his presence immediately commanding attention. The crowd parted slightly, murmuring at the sight of a tall, broad-shouldered man in an immaculate suit striding forward with the confidence of someone who had never once been ignored in his life. The biker noticed him and gave a mocking grin, clearly entertained by the idea of a businessman thinking he could interfere. Michael's eyes, cold and sharp as steel, locked onto the man, and in a voice that carried authority without needing to shout, he said, "Give her the bear." For a second, the biker seemed caught off guard by the tone, but then he laughed, the sound rough and mocking. "And if I don't?" he sneered, shifting his weight as though challenging him. The little girl stopped reaching, her tearful gaze flicking up to Michael with something between hope and fear. She hugged her small arms across her chest, her lips trembling, and Michael felt his chest constrict. He had faced men far more dangerous than this one in corporate boardrooms, men who could bankrupt nations with a single stroke of a pen, but never had he felt a threat strike so personally. The biker leaned down closer to the child, shaking the bear just out of reach again, and Michael's patience snapped. He took 2 swift steps forward, closing the distance until he stood eye to eye with the man. He didn't raise his voice, but the edge in it was unmistakable as he repeated, slower this time, "Give her the bear." The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd held its breath, phones raised, anticipation flickering in their eyes. The biker shifted, perhaps expecting Michael to back down, but when he met the unflinching ice in the CEO's gaze, his grin faltered. For a moment they stood locked in silent combat, the weight of dominance hanging between them. And then, with a scoff meant to cover his hesitation, the biker tossed the bear carelessly toward the girl. She gasped, scrambling to catch it, and when she clutched it to her chest, tears spilled anew down her cheeks, not of sorrow this time, but of fragile relief. She buried her face in the worn fur of the toy, whispering words that only she and the bear could hear. Michael knelt beside her, resting one large hand lightly on her small shoulder, his voice softening in a way that surprised even him. "You're safe now," he said. The girl looked up at him with wide, wet eyes, as though trying to decide if she could truly believe him. The crowd began to disperse as sirens wailed in the distance, someone having called the police. The biker cursed under his breath, stepping back as though the fight had never been worth it, and the onlookers' whispers turned to condemnation now that the danger had passed. Michael ignored them all. His world, for the first time in years, had narrowed to one frightened child and the fragile teddy bear she clung to as though it held her entire universe. In that instant, Michael Reeves, the man who had spent a lifetime building walls of wealth and power, realized he could not simply walk away. Something about the girl's trembling form and desperate grip had lodged itself deep within him. He didn't yet understand why, but he knew with certainty that this encounter was only the beginning. Police sirens drew closer, their wailing echo bouncing off the buildings as the crowd began to thin. The biker, suddenly less sure of himself, tried to slip away, but two officers cut him off before he reached the edge of the street. Michael straightened to his full height, his hand still resting protectively on the girl's trembling shoulder, and for the first time that evening he allowed himself a steadying breath. One officer approached him, asking quickly what had happened, and Michael recounted the scene with clipped precision, pointing out witnesses who had filmed everything on their phones. As the biker was led away, cursing under his breath, Michael looked down at the little girl who clutched the bear so tightly it seemed as though she feared it would be ripped away again at any moment. Her knuckles were white around its worn fur, and her small frame trembled despite the summer warmth. The officers asked the girl a few gentle questions, but her answers were short and quiet, her voice almost lost in the city noise. She gave her name, Lily, and when they asked where her parents were, she hesitated before whispering, "I don't have any." Michael felt those words strike deep, sharper than any accusation he had faced in his career. He turned slightly to the officer, asking for clarification, and learned that she lived at an orphanage a few blocks away. She had been seen before wandering the streets, but always returned before dark. Tonight, however, had nearly ended differently, and Michael's chest tightened at the thought of how close she had come to being hurt. When the officers finished, one of them suggested they could escort Lily back to the orphanage, but the girl immediately clutched Michael's leg with one hand, pressing her face into the side of his suit as though the thought of being separated from him terrified her. Michael froze at the unexpected gesture. He had never been anyone's source of comfort, he had been feared, respected, envied, but rarely trusted. Yet this child, who had known him for less than an hour, clung to him as though her survival depended on it. He rested a hand on her back, feeling the sharp angles of her thin frame beneath the fabric of her red dress, and realized she was not only frightened but undernourished, a child who had lived with far less than she deserved. "Let me take her," he heard himself say before he could stop. The officers glanced at him, recognizing his face instantly. Few in the city didn't know Michael Reeves, and after a pause, they nodded. They would file a report and notify the orphanage that she was safe. Michael thanked them curtly and, adjusting his jacket, crouched to meet Lily's gaze. Her wide blue eyes shimmered in the glow of the streetlights, still wet with tears but filled with something new, something fragile. "You're coming with me," he said gently, and she nodded without hesitation, slipping her tiny hand into his much larger one. As he led her toward his car, Michael couldn't ignore the weight that settled on him. The child walked quietly, her teddy bear clutched to her chest, her small steps quickening to match his stride. He opened the passenger door and carefully helped her climb inside, noticing how the luxury leather seats seemed far too large for her tiny frame. She sat stiffly at first, uncertain, before hugging her bear tighter and peering out the window as though afraid the world outside might still snatch him away. Michael got behind the wheel, but for once he wasn't thinking about his next meeting or the endless stream of decisions that awaited him. His thoughts were consumed only by the fragile figure seated beside him. The drive to the orphanage was silent except for the hum of the engine. At one point Lily whispered, almost as if confessing a secret, that bear was my mom's gift." Her voice cracked, and Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He didn't know what to say, but he understood now why she had fought so desperately for the toy. It wasn't just a bear, it was her last link to a life she had lost. He glanced at her, at the way she pressed her cheek against the worn fur, and something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, like the cracking of stone. When they arrived at the orphanage, the building looked old and tired, its paint peeling and the front steps cracked. A woman greeted them at the door, relief washing over her features when she saw Lily safe, though her scolding tone quickly followed as she reminded the girl not to wander so far again. Lily shrank behind Michael, her small hand refusing to let go of his. The director looked at him curiously, clearly recognizing who he was, and thanked him for bringing the child back. Michael responded politely, but his eyes lingered on Lily, who now stood in the doorway, clutching her bear and watching him with a look that pierced straight through him. As he turned to leave, she whispered so softly he almost didn't hear, "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight he could not shake. Driving away, Michael stared at the road ahead, but his mind remained fixed on the little girl in the red dress, her trembling voice, and the way her small hand had clung to his as though it had found an anchor in the storm. For the first time in years, he felt unsettled, not because of a failing deal or a looming financial crisis, but because he knew he could not simply walk away from what had just happened. Something about Lily had unsettled his carefully ordered world, and though he didn't yet understand why, he knew this was not the last time their paths would cross. Michael tried to resume his routine the next day, arriving at the office before dawn as he always did, his assistants already waiting with folders of reports and a schedule packed with calls, negotiations, and appearances. Yet as he sat at the long mahogany conference table surrounded by board members who hung on his every word, he found his mind drifting back to the image of Lily in her red dress, clutching that worn bear as though it were her last tether to the world. Numbers on spreadsheets blurred together, contracts became meaningless, and for the first time in his career, he struggled to summon the ruthless focus that had built his empire. His colleagues noticed the distraction, exchanging cautious glances, but no one dared comment. Michael Reeves was not a man to be questioned, yet beneath his sharp suit and steady voice, his thoughts were consumed entirely by a small girl in an old orphanage across the city. That evening, after his driver brought the car around, Michael surprised himself by giving a different address. Instead of heading to his penthouse, he ordered a detour toward the orphanage. The driver hesitated but quickly obeyed, glancing at him through the mirror with curiosity he did not voice. When the car pulled up in front of the weathered building, Michael felt an odd tightness in his chest. He had walked into hostile negotiations with billionaires and dictators without flinching, but the thought of stepping out of the car and seeing Lily again filled him with a nervousness that felt foreign. Still, he opened the door and approached the orphanage. The director met him with a mixture of surprise and suspicion, her eyes wary as she asked what had brought him back so soon. Michael explained simply that he wanted to check on Lily, to make sure she was all right after the incident. The woman hesitated, clearly torn between gratitude and mistrust, but at last she allowed him in. Inside, the walls were covered in faded paint and children's drawings, the floors scuffed from years of wear. Michael was struck by the stark contrast to the world he inhabited, the pristine glass and polished steel of his empire. Here everything spoke of survival, not luxury. He heard laughter from down the hall, followed by footsteps, and then Lily appeared. She froze when she saw him, her blue eyes widening in shock, and for a moment neither spoke. Then, clutching her bear, she broke into a smile so pure it caught him off guard. She ran to him, her curls bouncing, and wrapped her small arms around his leg in a gesture of unfiltered trust. Michael bent down, resting a careful hand on her back, and asked how she was. She answered simply, "Better, because you came." The sincerity of her words cut through him in a way that boardroom praise never had. They sat together in the orphanage's small common room, where the furniture was mismatched and the air smelled faintly of old books and cleaning supplies. Lily sat close beside him, chattering about her day in a way that was both childlike and heartbreakingly mature. She told him how the other children teased her sometimes for always carrying her bear, how she dreamed of one day living in a house with her own room, and how she missed her mother's lullabies, though she admitted she barely remembered them anymore. Michael listened intently, more present in that moment than he had been in years, and something inside him shifted as he realized how much this child carried on her small shoulders. When it was time for him to leave, Lily walked him to the door, her hand gripping his as though reluctant to let go. She looked up at him with solemn eyes and asked if he would come back. The question lingered in the air, heavy with hope and fear. Michael, who had built his entire life on avoiding personal entanglements, felt the answer rise before he could stop it. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll come back." Her smile returned, small but radiant, and she hugged him again before retreating into the orphanage, the bear still clutched tightly to her chest. As Michael returned to his car, he realized with a jolt that his world had shifted permanently. The deals waiting on his desk, the endless cycle of wealth and power, suddenly felt hollow compared to the fragile smile of a child who had no one else to rely on. He leaned back against the leather seat, closing his eyes as the city lights flickered past the window, and for the first time in years, he questioned everything he thought he knew about success, responsibility, and what it truly meant to live a meaningful life. The following week, Michael found himself returning to the orphanage more often than he admitted even to himself. At first, he told his assistant that he had personal matters to attend to, but eventually, he stopped bothering with excuses. His visits became the only part of his day that mattered. Each time he walked through the old wooden doors, he was met by the same sight, Lily racing toward him with her curls flying, her teddy bear bouncing in her arms, and her smile wide enough to light the dim corridor. He would crouch down to catch her, steadying her as she threw her arms around his neck, and in those moments, the weight of his empire melted away. For the first time in years, someone embraced him without calculation or agenda, simply out of joy that he had come back. The orphanage staff began to look at him differently. At first, there was suspicion, a question behind their eyes about why a powerful man would suddenly show so much interest in one small girl. But over time, they began to soften as they saw how genuine his attention was. He never arrived with cameras or reporters, never sought recognition for his donations, though he had quietly begun covering expenses for new clothes, books, and repairs to the building. Instead, he spent his hours sitting cross-legged on the worn carpet in the playroom, letting Lily show him her drawings or playing with blocks while the other children slowly gathered around, curious about the tall man in the immaculate suit who seemed so out of place and yet so patient with them. One evening, as the sky outside darkened and the hum of the city quieted, Michael sat with Lily at a small wooden table covered in crayons and scraps of paper. She was bent over a drawing, her tongue sticking out in concentration, while he watched, strangely captivated by the simple act. At last, she pushed the paper toward him. It was a picture of herself holding her bear, standing beside a tall figure with brown hair and blue eyes. She had drawn his suit in bright blue, her childish hand trying to capture every detail. Above them was a shaky sun and a house with windows. "That's us," she said softly. "That's my new family." Michael stared at the picture longer than he should have, his throat tightening in a way he hadn't felt since he was a child himself. He tried to speak but found no words, only a rush of emotions he had spent decades burying. He folded the picture carefully, slipping it into his breast pocket as though it were worth more than any contract he had ever signed. Looking at her, he felt something he had not known he was missing: belonging. The director of the orphanage approached him later that night. She was a practical woman, her life spent balancing compassion with the harsh realities of limited resources, but she spoke to him with unusual softness. She told him how Lily often cried herself to sleep, whispering to the bear as if it could bring her mother back. She explained how the other children sometimes resented her quietness, how her loneliness set her apart. Michael listened without interrupting, every word deepening his resolve. He asked what Lily's future might look like if she remained there, and the director, though kind, could not disguise the truth. Without a family, Lily's path would be uncertain, shaped by institutions and chance, not by love. Driving home that night, Michael sat in silence, the city lights blurring past the window. He thought of the years he had wasted chasing power, of the emptiness of his sprawling penthouse where silence echoed through empty rooms, and of the little girl who had drawn him into her world with nothing more than a smile and a bear. He realized that for all his wealth and success, he had built a life without roots, without legacy, without love. And now, fate had placed Lily in front of him, a fragile child who needed protection as much as he needed redemption. As he stepped into his vast, immaculate apartment, Michael felt its hollowness more acutely than ever before. He loosened his tie, sat on the edge of his bed, and pulled the folded drawing from his pocket. The childish lines and bright colors seemed to glow in the dim light of the room. For the first time in decades, Michael Reeves, the man who had been defined by ambition, by power, by ruthlessness, let his head fall into his hands and admitted to himself that he could no longer live as he had before. Something had changed irreversibly. Lily was no longer just a child he had helped one night. She was the beginning of something greater, something terrifying, and something that felt like hope. Michael woke the next morning with a heaviness in his chest that was not the familiar stress of quarterly projections or looming deadlines. It was the weight of choice. For years he had lived with decisions that affected thousands, mergers, acquisitions, entire industries bending under the influence of his pen. Yet none of those choices had ever left him pacing the length of his bedroom in the early hours, staring at the folded drawing still resting on his nightstand. Lily's childish sketch of herself, her bear, and the tall figure beside her, him, felt like both a promise and a demand. He could not shake the way she had looked at him when she called it her new family, nor the raw ache in his chest when he realized how much she meant it. For her, it was no game. For him, it had awakened a truth he could no longer ignore. At the office, his assistants noticed immediately that something was different. Michael was present in body but not in spirit, signing documents without reading them carefully, his gaze wandering toward the window as though he were searching for something outside the glass towers. Colleagues who had once feared his sharp mind and unwavering attention now exchanged cautious glances, whispering among themselves about his distraction. Even during a critical negotiation with investors overseas, his thoughts drifted back to the orphanage, to the way Lily had clutched his hand and whispered that she wanted him to return. The empire he had built over decades suddenly felt fragile, its value paling beside the simple trust of a child. That evening, he abandoned his schedule entirely and returned to the orphanage unannounced. The director raised an eyebrow at his repeated visits, her tone carrying both gratitude and wariness as she admitted him inside. This time he found Lily sitting by a window with her bear, her legs swinging idly as she hummed softly to herself. When she saw him, her eyes widened with surprise, and then she launched herself into his arms with a joy that warmed him in places he thought had long gone cold. She peppered him with questions about where he had been, if he had thought about her, and whether he had eaten dinner, her concern so earnest it disarmed him completely. He told her he had thought about her every moment, and though it sounded strange coming from his lips, he realized it was the truth. They spent hours together in the common room. Lily insisted on teaching him a game with marbles that he failed miserably at, which made her laugh so hard she fell against him in fits of giggles. He read her a story from a battered book, his voice steadying as he discovered that she leaned closer with every page. For once, his phone remained in his pocket, unanswered even as it buzzed relentlessly with calls from his office. In those hours, the empire did not exist. There was only Lily, her laughter, and the feeling that he was building something real for the first time in his life. Later, when the other children were ushered to bed, Lily lingered near him, reluctant to let the night end. She finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air since his first visit. "Can you take me home with you?" Her voice was small, but it carried a weight that struck him to the core. Michael looked into her wide blue eyes, his breath caught in his chest, and though he could not promise her yet, the thought had already begun to take root. He told her gently that it wasn't that simple, that there were rules and papers and people who made decisions, but she only nodded, clutching her bear tightly, and said, "I don't care about papers. I just want a family." When he finally left the orphanage that night, the words echoed in his mind with relentless persistence. In his penthouse, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt meaningless, he poured himself a drink he didn't touch. Instead, he sat staring out at the glittering skyline, thinking not of his company, not of his wealth, but of a small girl who had already carved her way into his heart. He realized with startling clarity that he wanted to be the one to give her what she longed for. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Michael Reeves was not planning his next business conquest but imagining the possibility of becoming a father. It frightened him, but beneath the fear was a sense of purpose so strong it left him breathless. Michael spent the next several days in a haze of conflicting obligations, torn between the relentless demands of his corporate empire and the quiet, insistent pull of Lily's presence in his life. Each morning he stepped into the boardroom with a face as composed as marble, listening to analysts discuss market fluctuations and shareholders press for aggressive expansion, yet his mind drifted back again and again to the orphanage's modest common room, where Lily had laughed at his clumsy attempts to play marbles and asked with trembling sincerity if he could take her home. He had built a reputation on clarity and decisiveness, on being the man who always knew the right path forward, but now he found himself paralyzed, staring at spreadsheets that seemed meaningless beside the memory of her blue eyes searching his face for reassurance. At night, the silence of his penthouse pressed on him more heavily than ever before. Once it had been a sanctuary, a symbol of achievement with its towering windows and flawless design, but now it felt hollow, a gilded cage devoid of life. He imagined Lily there, her laughter echoing against the cold marble floors, her small form running down the endless hallways that had always felt too empty. The thought both warmed and unsettled him because it forced him to confront the truth he had long avoided: all the wealth, all the power, had never filled the void inside him. She had, without realizing it, exposed how empty his triumphs really were. Unable to resist the pull any longer, Michael arranged another visit to the orphanage, but this time he requested to meet with the director privately. The conversation was formal at first, her tone cautious as she outlined the policies and procedures involved in adoption, reminding him of the seriousness of the decision. She told him of Lily's history again, the loss of her mother, the absence of her father, the years spent waiting in limbo. Michael listened intently, his jaw tight, because every detail only deepened his conviction that she deserved more than the life she had been handed. When the director asked why a man like him would want to take on such responsibility, he gave an answer that surprised even himself. He told her that he had lived his entire life chasing success but had never once found peace, and that the first time Lily smiled at him, he had finally understood what it meant to feel at home. That night, after leaving the orphanage, he could not return to his penthouse. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city, past neighborhoods where children played in the fading light and families gathered for dinner in small apartments, their laughter spilling through open windows. He envied them in a way that felt raw and humbling, because they possessed something he had never been able to buy or build. Eventually, he parked his car near the river and sat in silence, the city lights flickering across the water, and he admitted to himself what he had been circling for days: he wanted to be Lily's father. The idea terrified him, because it meant stepping into a role he had no experience with, one that demanded more vulnerability than he had ever allowed. But it also exhilarated him, filling him with a sense of purpose that no contract had ever inspired. The next morning he called his lawyers, not to discuss mergers or acquisitions, but to inquire about adoption law. Their surprise was obvious, though they hid it behind professional tones, and for the first time in years he didn't care what people thought. This was not a business transaction to him, though he knew there would be paperwork and scrutiny. This was a matter of the heart, and he would not let bureaucracy deter him. Still, doubts crept in. He wondered if he was capable of being the man Lily needed, if his life of privilege and detachment had left him too unprepared to nurture a child who had known nothing but loss. Yet each time fear threatened to overwhelm him, he remembered the way she had clung to him on the street, the way her voice had cracked when she whispered that her bear was her mother's gift, and he knew he could not walk away. When he returned to the office later that day, his staff noticed a change in him. He carried himself with the same confidence, but there was a fire in his eyes that had nothing to do with business. He turned down several invitations to high-profile events, redirected his energy toward tying up loose ends that would allow him to step back, and began reshaping his life quietly but deliberately. The empire that once consumed him no longer felt like his sole legacy. He was beginning to build something far greater, though only he and one small girl with a teddy bear truly knew it yet. By the end of the week, Michael Reeves, once defined entirely by ambition and control, stood at the threshold of a decision that would alter his life forever. He was still afraid, still unsure of the man he could become, but he understood with complete clarity that the path ahead would not lead him back to the life he had known. It would lead him forward, into a future built not on power, but on love. And though he had no experience in love, he was ready to learn, because for the first time in his life, someone needed him not for what he could provide, but simply for who he was. The process began quietly, with paperwork, background checks, and endless questions from social workers who wanted to know not about his net worth or his business empire, but about his heart and his intentions. For a man who had spent his life answering to no one, it was a humbling experience to sit across from people who did not care about his status and who asked whether he knew how to cook a meal, whether he would be present for a child's school events, whether he understood what it meant to comfort a child through nightmares. At first, he bristled at the intrusion, but over time he began to see the importance of every question. They weren't trying to test his pride, they were trying to measure his capacity to love, and that was something money could never prove. During those weeks, Michael visited Lily as often as the orphanage would allow. He brought books and puzzles, he read her bedtime stories, and he sat on the floor surrounded by crayons and paper while she taught him to draw clumsy hearts and crooked flowers. Slowly, the other children warmed to him too, no longer regarding him as an outsider but as someone who made their evenings brighter. Lily, however, never left his side for long. Wherever he sat, she curled up beside him, her bear tucked under her chin, her small hand often clutching his sleeve as though afraid he might vanish. Each time he prepared to leave, her eyes filled with a familiar sadness, but when he promised he would come back, she began to believe him. The trust in her gaze grew stronger each day, and with it grew his determination never to betray it. The director of the orphanage, who had once regarded him with suspicion, began to change her tone as well. She told him one evening that she had never seen Lily so alive, that the girl who used to sit quietly in the corner now laughed and played with the others because she knew someone was watching out for her. Hearing that stirred something deep in Michael, because he realized he had already become a part of her world, and in many ways she had already become the center of his. Yet he knew the process would not be simple, that there were still hurdles to overcome, including the scrutiny of the courts and the questions of whether a man like him could truly provide not just materially but emotionally. One evening, after a particularly long day filled with interviews and forms, Michael stayed longer at the orphanage than he usually did. The children had all gone to bed except for Lily, who sat drowsily in his lap with her head against his chest. The dim light cast soft shadows across the room, and in that silence he felt something he had never experienced before: peace. Her breathing was steady, her warmth grounding him in a way no possession ever had. He thought of all the nights he had spent alone in his penthouse, the emptiness that echoed around him, and he realized that this small, fragile child had filled that void completely without even trying. He pressed a kiss to her curls before carrying her gently to her bed, tucking the bear under her arm, and for a moment he lingered there, watching her sleep. It struck him then how profoundly she had altered his life. Driving home that night, Michael didn't feel the usual restlessness or hollow ache that often followed him. Instead, he felt a growing sense of certainty. He was stepping into unknown territory, risking a vulnerability that terrified him, but he also knew he was building something real, something enduring. He understood that there would be challenges, late nights, illnesses, tears, questions he might not know how to answer, but none of that frightened him as much as the idea of losing her. The thought of Lily returning to a life without him was unbearable. The next morning, when he stood before the mirror adjusting his tie, he saw a man transformed. His reflection was still sharp, still powerful, but there was a new softness in his eyes, a quiet strength that came not from wealth or control but from devotion. He realized that for the first time in his life, he was not preparing to conquer a market or secure a deal. He was preparing to fight for a child, to fight for the right to call her his daughter, and that battle mattered more than anything he had ever faced. And in that moment, he understood that no matter how long the process took or how hard the road might be, he would not stop until Lily was home with him, not as a visitor, not as a responsibility, but as family. The day of the final hearing arrived with a weight that Michael had not felt since the earliest days of building his empire, but this time it was not anxiety over profits or power, it was the knowledge that his entire future, and Lily's, hung in the balance. The courtroom was not grand like the boardrooms he was accustomed to, but it carried a gravity that humbled him. Rows of worn wooden benches lined the space, and at the front sat a judge who would decide whether he was worthy of becoming the father Lily so desperately needed. Social workers and legal representatives shuffled papers and whispered to one another, but Michael sat still, his light blue suit crisp, his posture tall, and his blue eyes focused not on the officials around him but on the small girl seated beside him. Lily wore a simple dress the orphanage had given her, her curls brushed neatly, her teddy bear held tightly in her arms. She looked nervous, her little legs swinging off the bench, but when Michael leaned closer and whispered that everything would be all right, she gave him a small, trusting nod that nearly broke his composure. The hearing unfolded slowly, with questions about his lifestyle, his fitness to raise a child, and his commitment to provide not only wealth but love and presence. For once, Michael did not lean on rehearsed statements or calculated words. He spoke with honesty that startled even him, telling the judge how he had spent years believing success was measured in numbers, only to discover that true success had walked into his life one night in the form of a frightened little girl clutching a bear. He confessed that he was terrified of failing her, but he also knew he would never abandon her, that he was ready to learn how to be a father even if it meant unlearning everything else he thought defined him. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, his voice steady but raw with emotion, and when he finished, he glanced at Lily, who was watching him with wide blue eyes, her tiny hand reaching for his. The judge asked Lily if she wanted to live with him. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Lily hugged her bear, looked at Michael, and then nodded with certainty. "I want him to be my dad," she said softly, her voice trembling but clear. The simplicity of her words carried more weight than any argument, and Michael felt a surge of emotion crash through him. The judge leaned back, studying them both carefully, and after a long pause, announced the decision. The petition was granted. Michael Reeves was now, in the eyes of the law, Lily's father. The moment the gavel struck, Lily dropped her bear for the first time since he had known her and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face against him. Michael held her tightly, his composure finally breaking as tears filled his eyes. He had stood victorious in countless battles, but this was the first time he felt he had truly won something worth fighting for. Around them, people murmured and shuffled out of the courtroom, but Michael barely noticed. All that mattered was the little girl in his arms, whispering "Daddy" against his shoulder. The days that followed were filled with change, but instead of overwhelming him, they brought a sense of renewal. Lily moved into his penthouse, and for the first time the vast, echoing space felt like a home. Her laughter filled the marble halls, her toys scattered across polished floors, her drawings taped onto the walls without hesitation. Michael learned how to braid her hair badly, how to cook simple meals that she insisted tasted better than anything fancy his chefs had ever made, and how to sit beside her bed until she fell asleep with her bear tucked under her chin. There were difficult moments too, nightmares that woke her crying, moments when she tested whether he would really stay, but each time, Michael was there, patient, steady, proving with actions what words could never fully convey. One evening, as the sun set and the city outside glowed with golden light, Michael sat on the balcony with Lily curled up in his lap. She was humming softly to her bear, the same lullaby her mother had once sung to her, and Michael closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He realized then that his life had come full circle, from cold ambition to something infinitely warmer and more fragile. He had not lost himself in choosing this path, he had found himself for the first time. Looking down at the little girl who had given him a second chance at life, he whispered a promise he intended to keep until his last breath. "You'll never be alone again." In that moment, the man the world had known as an untouchable millionaire CEO ceased to exist. In his place stood a father, imperfect but determined, and a child who had been saved not by wealth, but by love. Together, they formed a family born not of blood, but of choice, and their story, painful, improbable, and miraculous, was only just beginning.